Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the SD.RB podcast. Today, Dominic Damian is going to be sharing with us some different options for deploying Rails applications.
Already? Okay. So this is a basic generic overview of pretty much the basics of getting from your laptop to deploying an app into production. Some of you might be wondering who the heck I am. I'm a web developer and a student. I go to State. I'm gonna go here, but then ended up not going here. I work for Integral with Chris back there. You might remember that from Outlandish, which you've probably heard enough about. I also do some side stuff for TextDrive and Joint. Their data center down here in San Diego, so I help out with monitoring, that kind of stuff. I used to do support tickets with them. And so all this stuff's not exactly stuff that I've done with the apps that I've deployed. Some of it is, but a lot of it's just keeping up to date. And Jason, who used to live down here, is kind of one of the de facto guys on this, so I picked his brain quite a bit and just got a lot of knowledge from him. So that's where a lot of this came from. So basically, there's a pretty standard process that we all have. We develop the app locally, and most of us probably do it on a Mac. And then we deploy the app somewhere, which is probably a hosted account at TextDrive or DreamHost or whoever. And then we pray, because it sucks. It's gotten better, but it's still kind of iffy unless you know where to go. So I figured I'd start off with the basic stuff. If you're a local development, you use one of 3 web servers most likely, or Locomotive, but I don't recommend it. You use your local database, SQLite, MySQL, whatever. But that only covers your development and testing. It doesn't really have anything to do with production. So once you move past that, that's where like the fun starts to happen, or it's almost like a whole other phase of development. And it sucks. And it's actually like the best description I've heard is it's a vertical stack. So there's not really like one answer or one solution to deployment or production. You kind of have to follow everything that you can, in the sense that something could go wrong in one spot and it affects everything else. But you can't really look at it as each component. It's a lot of things. So the first thing that you probably have in terms of like the architecture would be a load balancer. You could have that as a hardware load balancer or software. And I'll get to some examples of each of these inside. Then you've got your front-end web server like Apache or Lighty or what have you that handles most of your static content. Then you got to deal with any type of caching that you want to do. Rails has some built-in caching. You can cache stuff from the web server itself. And there's a lot of stuff you can do with that. But that's another thing you want to keep an eye on. Then you basically decide how you want your Rails app to run. And right now the basic choice is between FastCGI through Lighty or Mongrel through whatever else you want. Let's get to those. Your database, and I'll explain in a minute. It doesn't really matter what database you choose, because Rails is pretty good about working with a lot of databases, and with migrations it doesn't really matter what kind of database you use. So you can use MySQL or Postgres, whatever you want. For deployment, there's Capistrano, which is really awesome. It's actually it's really well documented, but there's not a lot of recipes and stuff out there yet, which I'm kind of surprised about, but I'm guessing that'll pick up. They just got a mailing list that's got some cool stuff on it, so it's getting a lot more use. And then Subversion, obviously, and I only threw that in there because you don't want to use like FTP or anything like that really to deploy, because you're probably going to be developing it locally a lot, and just whatever you decide to deploy to, make sure Subversion is installed, check out a copy, and then when you update your copy, just SVN up. This is probably the easiest way. So there's different web servers and load balances, which is, I kind of call that the front end. The best choice, in my opinion, right now is probably Apache 2.2 with the mod proxy balancer module installed in it, which allows you to run Mongrel behind it. You can run, and I actually hadn't seen it, but James just put an article out yesterday about running Mongrel through 1.3. So, for example, our server, we've had some trouble getting to 2.2. So if you can't get up to 2.2, you have to use 1.3. There's an article about that. They're out there handling that for Mongrel. But most people use Apache 1.3 for Lighty, and FastCGI, and proxy it through that way. There's Lighty completely, just using it as a whole, or you could use Lighty to proxy Mongrel, but the mod proxy support I think is still broken. Kevin might be able to help with confirming that or denying that, but yeah, the next release it might be fixed and shrunk, but I think it's still broken. And then there's a new thing called Nginx, which I'll get to in a second, which is kind of a new thing that's popped up in about the last month. Then there's your load balancers, Pound, Pen, and the hardware. I haven't used any three of those except for the big IP, and that was only because it was already installed. So I'm not really a good source on which of those is good, but if you go to the Mongrel site, for example, they've got examples on how to run all of those and set up all those configurations pretty easily. There's your databases, and I didn't really go into this because to me it's more of a personal preference. SQLite, which you really would only use in production, only for development. MySQL and Postgres, which are probably the two that you're mostly going to use, and then Oracle if you get to that point or something like that. And it's really open, like I said, because Rails doesn't really care what kind of database you use, as long as you're using some kind of database. Caching, something that I've been playing with Chris on Outlandish a lot, and looking into what needs fit us. And there's a lot out there. Rails has a bunch of built-in stuff, obviously. There's page caching, action caching, fragment caching, and then Chris mentioned that one I forgot, which is SQL query caching. They're all good and bad, but the basic thing that I noticed, and there's an article I read that kind of pointed it all out, that for handling any kind of dynamic content, they all have their negatives, and since most Rails apps are going to handle dynamic content, they kind of fall short on a lot of things. So one of the plugins I found out there is called Content Caching. It's by Coda Hail. It's really, really easy to install. It's just adding a filter to your controllers, basically, that you want to cache, or any method you want to cache. But the biggest problem with it is that they don't expire by default. So you got to go in and install or write a cache sweeper to get rid of everything, or they'll just sit there forever. There's also a new one out written by the guys that are the blog, Chris Wainsworth and TJ Hyatt, I think. And that uses memcached, which basically caches your SQL queries, so that once you've requested something, you don't have to continually go through that request. So basically, you need to find your best fit for caching. It's something that you probably want to do once you get to the point of production, but I wouldn't worry about it while you're developing so much, because you can go back and pretty much put it in when you need to. And then a note on the memcached stuff is that it only really works if you have the request to keep up with it. If you're not getting a huge amount of traffic, it's not really going to do any benefit. The best way would be to go back and rework your queries and stuff like that for that kind of performance. But unless you're getting a lot of traffic, it's kind of overkill. So you write the apps and the tests first, get everything working smoothly, and then keep them a few days at the end of it to add your caching. Some of the monitoring tools that I've come across, used a few of them, haven't used a few of them. Query Trace, which is something you would use in development. The MySQL Query Analyzer, which I'm not sure how new it is, but it basically just analyzes all your SQL queries. Use that in development as well. The Rails Analyzer, which you can run, and it'll analyze your production logs, tell you where you have some bottlenecks, stuff like that. dwatch, which is something I read about today. It's really simple. It's basically a cron job. You put on a shared hosting server, and when it sees a process die, it'll send off an email. And if your web host supports emailing with cron jobs, you'll get a notification when your server dies. So hopefully you don't need that too much. Other things to monitor, and this is more for if you have your own dedicated server that you set up. Disk usage is huge, database load, memory uses, any load that you have on specific processes, and then your exceptions. One thing that Jason at the last workshop that he did mention is that if you're in production, there's really no need to keep logging, because your tests, as Kevin would probably attest to, should basically make your app pretty bulletproof. And if you run into an error, just turn logs on. So if you have something like exception notifier or exception logger installed, then you'll get notified when there's an error. Go in, turn your production logs on, and then duplicate the error. Because if not, you're going to end up getting logs that are infinitely long that you have to go and clean up or version or whatever. So that's just a little thing. Not really, but it's more of a size thing. Especially if you're on like a shared host and you've got an app that you're not really sure like how big the log is going to be, and you wake up and your app's dead, and you go and you see a 400 megabyte log file. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's something like exception notifier. It'll send you an email when something crashes, kind of the same way, and it's just you can go in, turn it on, duplicate the error, find it, fix it, turn it back off. So then there's the backend side, which handles all of the Rails app, FastCGI or Mongrel, which kind of probably was a debate 6 months ago, but I think it's probably a pretty good statement to say that Mongrel's the best solution. FastCGI is kind of outdated just because Apache didn't really support it. Lighty kind of piggybacked it into its system, and then there was a replacement probably coming regardless of Mongrel, but it just turned out to be such a good replacement that it kind of fell into place. And it's stable, it's fast. Zed works on it, I think, for his full-time job, so it's not going away. It's going to be fine. And then for deployment, you want to use Mongrel Cluster, which is a plugin by Bradley Taylor, who's the guy that runs the Rails machine. And it just allows you to run different Mongrels across different ports. So you could set up one on 8001, one on 8002. And you could run like 5. It's the same thing as running like 5 FastCGI processes, but you can run 5 Mongrel processes. And there's an article out there about like how many you should run for each app, and I'd say I think it was like 3, but it basically explains like how to do that math. For your front-end web server, it obviously serves your static content. By that I mean like any non-Rails files. So if you have like some kind of PHP inside of it, Apache would proxy that or serve that. And then also your static files inside your Rails app, so your style sheets, your public files, stuff like that. And then you proxy dynamic content through, I put Mongrel, but it proxies it through whatever. It could be FastCGI. So basically you have your Mongrel running on those ports, your front-end web server listens for those ports, and then when those ports do whatever, it generates the content for that. One thing that came up on the Mongrel mailing list is that by default, it actually, Mongrel will serve all your static content. So you want to go in and make sure that your logs aren't spitting out any type of view stuff, because that's stuff that should be handled by the web server, and by default it doesn't. So just something to keep an eye out for. And like I said before, the best solution is probably Apache 2.2, Lighty 1, whatever. And then there's this new thing that I've been playing with a little bit. It's called Nginx. It's built in Russia, but it's not in Russian. It's really lightweight. It runs on any Unix, Nix platform. There's help available out there for it. There's a wiki, which I put a link to at the end of this. It's got a ton of information. Ezra, who's one of the de facto deployment guys, has a ton of stuff for it. I put up a short tutorial about how to get it running on a OS X. It's been in development since 2000, and the government of Russia uses it for their website. There's some big projects out there using it, so it's kind of proven, but it's also catching on here, so we'll see how it goes. It's really easy to configure caching in that. It's all inside the configuration file, and since you're probably going to end up downloading one anyways initially, you can find one out there that has Rails caching built into it. And it's supported by most other deployment guys. I know Zed's playing with it, Ezra's playing with it, I don't know who else is, but that was as of 2 weeks ago. And there's Capistrano, which is basically allows you to run rake tasks from your command line to deploy your app to multiple servers if you need to, or one server. You can roll back, you can roll forward. It's really easy. It's not too hard to learn. There's really one good tutorial out there on it, which is actually on the Capistrano site. And if you just read through that in about a half an hour, you should be ready to start playing with it. And they have new recipes out there that do a whole bunch of things. Like one today on the mailing list said that if you want to run all your tests on deployment and only deploy it if all the tests pass, there's a recipe out there for that. So you just include that in your rake task, hit deploy. If a test fails, it kicks it back, tells you it doesn't deploy the app until everything's stable. So that's kind of cool. And there's no front end yet, but I'm guessing there will be soon. So here's a basic shared hosting setup that TextDrive has. you've got your Apache, your vhost file, and then you normally have your own instance of Lighty and then your own instance of FastCGI. So if 3 people were on a shared server, this is what each of their accounts would look like, which sucks. So coming to hosting, I would not put anything on shared hosting except for staging or a blog, if that. And I say that having been doing stuff for TextDrive for over a year, so it's just not worth it. So virtualization is really the only solution that there is out there at the moment. That's probably your best bet, and that's basically you get your own like container of an operating system inside of a dedicated server. So you have basic like root access. You can add your own gems. You can add your own packages, whatever. If you screw something up, it only kind of really hurts you instead of the other 25 people on your machine. And examples of that are Zen. VMware is a really kind of basic one. And then Solaris Zones, which is what TextDrive uses. But most people use Zen because it's free and it's online. If you have to separate your hardware, that's like when you start getting the big stuff, which I haven't had to do this, but there might be people that did. First, separate the DB from the processor, then separate the storage from everything else. So you basically have a stack of your processor, which handles your application, your DB, which handles your database requests, and then storage, which handles all your data. Separate those out over hardware. You can all talk together. That way, if one dies, they don't all die. But that's kind of a bigger step. Dedicateds are really nice, but you still got to manage them. We have 2 of them, and it's a lot to keep everything up to date. Dedicated web hosts, which I'll get to my recommendations. They keep it up to date for you. You can email them or hop into a chat room to get them to fix something. So it's a really good solution if you can find the right hosts. And so my recommendation is actually Rails Machine. I've heard enough good things about them. I know Bradley keeps on top of everything, and I have not heard one complaint about their service. And they have their own gems and gems, or is it a gem or just a command line task that basically takes you from development to deployment and everything we went over like that. TextDrive has something called Zones, which is kind of the same thing. It doesn't have the gem that Rails Machine does to do the deployment, but it's essentially the same type of setup. And then Ezra has a service called Engine Yard, which is coming out soon, but I think that's going to be a little more of like a front-end driven kind of management tool, but I don't know. So here's what an old setup would kind of look like if you had your own dedicated server or your own VPS. You've got your internet, obviously, Lighty, and with the mod FastCGI, handling your FastCGI requests, hitting your database, and then if you're using some kind of SQL caching, or SQL caching for Memcache, I would go off and do that. And here's kind of the newer one, which is essentially the same thing, but instead of using Lighty, you're using Apache with mod proxy balancer, Mongrel clusters instead of Lighty or FastCGI processes, and the database and everything stays the same. So basically, it's a big thing. You got to find what fits for you. You can use shared hosting, a virtual private server, a dedicated. You can put a Mac Mini in your house and do everything yourself. It's really depends on what you need and what your skill level is and what your comfort level is. I'm not a sysadmin or anything, so it's a lot. There's a lot out there. Keep up to date because it changes daily. I just found that Nginx thing about a month ago. Mongrel's only been out for about 5 or 6 months in serious development, so who knows what it's going to be 6 months from now. So just keep on top of it. Join the mailing list. That's got a ton of info. A lot of it you're probably not going to ever care about, but then 1 or 2% you will, and it'll keep you up to speed. And don't fight it, because it's kind of important. So here's a bunch of links. I'll put the slides up somewhere online if you want them. They're mostly links to blogs and stuff and articles that I find useful. That's it. Unless anyone has any questions. So.
The internet.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know? You made sense, but what is real world?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really easy to configure. It's essentially just a configuration file you drop on. In my case, I did it on here, but on any unit or Linux server or whatever, and then you just start it up as a system process. But some other guys, in one of the links that I put up there, there's a guy named Alex Koroviv, some Russian guy, has been doing like benchmarking statistics between that and Lighty and Apache and all these other things for Rails apps, and it's just like smoking. So it's speed. It's really lightweight. It's the guy that develops it, I think, has kind of realized that it's catching on with the Rails community, so he's starting to actively develop it. So it's just another option, and it's one of those things that since all the options out there up to this point have been bad, since this one hasn't failed yet, it's kind of the new thing. So who knows what it's going to be in 3 months from now, but it's kind of got like that same feel that Mongrel did 6 months ago. That's why I recommend it. Mm-hmm. I don't think it has like its own like module to build into it. Does it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just asking. Okay, I'm taking Apache and my proxy.
Yeah.
And I'm build into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean you can you can proxy Mongo through Nginx, no problem. And I didn't put my link up there, but at the Integral blog, I've got a tutorial that tells you how to do all that. And it's super simple. So, anybody else? Cool, thanks.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.